Hey everybody, welcome back to Cloud Wrangling. On the last episode, we spoke briefly about the origins of the cloud and the hyperscale cloud service providers. And in this episode, I'd like to talk about how that origin story makes them special and how it brings value to your business. So, what is it that differentiates the top six, the big hyperscale cloud service providers from the rest of the world? What is that secret sauce? The general consensus would be the biggest thing that the large hyperscalers have that they bring to bear is a massive economy of scale, that they have access to software and software defined resources that no one else does, that they have the best personnel in the business from both the service catalog development side and support and general engineering, and that they have the best catalog of services. I think these are all valid differentiators, but I don't think they're what really makes the hyperscale cloud providers special. So going back as a reminder of who the big six hyperscale cloud service providers are, it's AWS, Azure, GCP or Google Cloud, Alibaba Cloud, Oracle, and IBM Cloud are generally considered the big six. But the big six cloud providers are the only ones that have massive global scale, right? They're the only ones that have data centers on across all the continents that have massive networks, right? Right? No, there's a bunch of other providers, large scale data center providers, CDN providers like Cloudflare and Fastly, Akamai. There are other companies that have the kind of scale and reach, or at least close to the kind of scale and reach that the hyperscale cloud providers do. But what makes the big six different from these types of companies? Is it because Akamai and some of the other CDN companies and the data center companies, they have space and they have data centers and they have networks, but they don't have application support. They don't have application services, right? Well, there are application service providers that have global scale, that have global reach, companies like Rackspace and OVH and C Square. These are companies that are across multiple continents with large amounts of data centers that do very similar things to what the cloud does. And a lot of them have some pretty mature service delivery models with self-service and some of the same things that the big six hyperscalers do. But what is it that the hyperscale cloud does that these types of companies don't or can't? Well, going back to the last video where we talk about where the hyperscale CSPs came from, um, that really factors into what their big value prop and what their big differentiator is. So where did the hyperscale CSPs come from? They came from being the internal application support and technology teams for some very large tier one businesses. And what did creating the software, the hardware, the processes, the orchestration that would eventually become the cloud, what did those offerings solve for these companies, for their applications? That's the question. The first thing that the creation of what is now the cloud, the software, the hardware, the processes, the orchestration solved, was a type of massive platform scalability that was difficult, if not impossible, within the existing bare metal data centers or within the existing service provider landscape that was available at the time that Amazon, Microsoft, and Google started creating what is now the cloud for their internal teams. It gave them massive scalability, orchestrated software-defined networking, storage, security, multi-data center, what's generally called availability zones now in cloud parlance originally just meant multiple data centers, and the ability to do multiple regions, so multiple geographic regions within a single platform. It also meant having dedicated WAN fabrics for networking within those DCs and within those regions to allow for that communication. What was another thing that they had to solve for was the ability to disaggregate compute, um, and make it cost effective. To move away from commercial products like VMware, to move into a more disaggregated solution like serverless compute platforms, the creation of Kubernetes, the creation of Lambda, OpenShift, things like this, which allowed moving compute below the hypervisor layer, and also to implement lower cost virtualization for thicker virtualized workloads. Amazon implementing Amazon's Zen hypervisor, um, ultimately their later on their Nitro hypervisor, the creation of KubeVirt, and the ability to run hypervised workloads on top of Kubernetes, using Hyper-V to ultimately become what became Azure Cloud Stack, um, large advances in KVM to allow Linux hypervisor without having to pay the enterprise tax for a VMware for virtualization. These are all things that were solved at scale, not to sell as a service catalog, not as a way to uh, create something that they could resell in the service provider space, but to solve the same problems with cost-effective compute for their internal business units. And probably the single largest thing that these companies, Amazon in particular, were able to solve for their own internal technology teams was the ability to create a scalable, cost effective data layer that could span multiple data centers for a single namespace. The advent of S3 really changed the way that you could deploy applications, and then also the ability to come up with things like EBS and other IP-based scalable block file systems just increased the ability and really made it to where you could run these types of enterprise applications in a multi-DC or multi-region capability. Also, the creation of serverless scale out NoSQL solutions like DynamoDB just allowed you to disaggregate from the large scale Transact SQL databases and made it easier to scale these applications up to scale. These are things that ultimately you would be able to use as a cloud customer for the same types of business use that they were able to get for their primary businesses. Another important pivot within all these companies' internal operational model was moving to more of an infrastructure as code, more of a software defined, orchestrated model for pretty much any tasks, deployment tasks, configuration tasks, because it was required by the scale that these applications were getting to that you couldn't have click ops and single hands on keyboard for doing operational and infrastructure changes. These things had to be codified. So this kind of robust orchestration, the kind of self-service that they were deploying for different internal business units, the ability to reduce operation and infrastructure headcount, and just the overall complexity of the environments meant that just this kind of orchestration was table stakes to get these things to work. This kind of orchestration is also what allowed the cloud to exist. So going back to the original premise of the video of what makes the largest hyperscale cloud service providers unique and what differentiates them from other large MSPs, especially given that the large MSPs like your Rackspaces and OVHs of the world had more experience in multi-tenant hosting, more experience in these kind of service models and service provider models than a company like Amazon or somebody would. What made them unique? They Cloud was created because the CSPs didn't start as CSPs. The biggest cloud providers started as and continue to be the internal technology team for these massive profitable businesses, the Googles, Amazons, Microsofts, and Alibabas. And because they didn't start as service providers, they weren't bound by the economics of creating catalogs of services to sell to customers. They weren't created on the if you build it, they will come model. Truly complex services like Kubernetes, S3, Lambda, EC2, and DynamoDB exist because they made internal business sense that justified the massive R&D of creating them. Because it would either make money or save money to very large corporations, not because they thought it would sell and it would be a service catalog they could resell to other people, but because it made sense to their core business to justify the R&D to create these services. And this comes to the biggest single paradigm shift of the cloud era. Because these internal solutions were created to increase scale or reduce costs, and they had the full backing of the top executives at these huge companies, the infrastructure teams could finally say, make your code fit my infrastructure and not the usual way around. So when these solutions were resold to the public by Microsoft, Google, Amazon, it allowed them to turn around and say the same thing to their external customers of make your code fit my infrastructure that they did to their internal customers, which was the application teams within their businesses. These came about as cloud native best practices for consuming cloud resources, and this simple change of adopting dev processes that fit the infrastructure scaling and configuration matrix is the single largest driver of scale in the cloud era. So what exactly makes the biggest hyperscale cloud service providers what we know is the public cloud? What makes them unique? The answer began as what made them unique was their original customers. Their original customers were Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Alibaba, their internal business units that they were supporting. That is what makes them unique because they were solving problems at scales that other service providers weren't able to reach. They were solving problems with R&D capital that other service providers weren't able to have access to. And they're beholden to a lot of very intelligent and very crafty internal application teams that have a lot of very smart ways to do things and hold their infrastructure teams to a very high standard. So the thing that makes the hyperscale cloud service providers unique is their original customers. The fact that they were able to create these applications are solely dependent on the fact that they had very large, very intelligent, very technical customers that helped create the infrastructure that became the cloud providers. And what continues to make these large scale CSPs unique is their largest customers. Customers that drive innovation and drive services that can be consumed by the rest of their customers. Customers that have enough scale and enough R&D and enough demand that they create solutions that filter down throughout the customer stack. So not just Amazon on AWS, but companies like Netflix and Sony. Netflix helped redesign Amazon's content delivery network because of their requirements and because of their scale. Companies like Walmart and Coca-Cola on Azure. These are huge customers that their unique business challenges end up creating catalogs of service that can be used for all the customers that use Azure. Same thing with PayPal and eBay on Google or ByteDance on Alibaba. I mean, these are massive customers, and the value that you get from the CSPs is these huge customers drive innovation and drive scale at a way that you wouldn't be able to tap into necessarily in your own data center. So the biggest value prop that you get from these hyperscale CSPs is their customers. Well, there you go. Now we know what makes the clouds rain. Thanks a lot. Have a great one.